Thank you. There's been a couple of questions that have come up repeatedly, and I want to touch on them before we get into the question and answer and comment period for the meeting tonight. Will there be public access? There's two answers to this question. On the National Wildlife Refuge portion, yes, we are going to entertain and accommodate those big six uses: the hunting, the fishing, the environmental education, interpretation, photography. All those things are part of our program. It's what we do. We're going to continue and maintain those programs. What about hiking and equestrian trail? This is a question that's come up quite a bit, and this is also something that we need to address. And there's a process, and I've got a slide here in a minute that's going to talk about this a little bit more. But we have to go through a process, a thought process of saying, is it appropriate to occur on a National Wildlife Refuge? Is it compatible with the reasons why the refuge was established? We have to consider whether it's safe. Do we have only one trail on the refuge, and we want to accommodate bikes, hikers, and horses? So we have to consider safety in any decision that we make. What about vehicle and boating access? As far as boating access, those lands associated with the state sovereign waters, the lakes, the Kissimmee River, those areas that you have access to currently, that's going to maintain and stay the same. We're not doing anything with state waters. If you have access to it now, you will maintain that access. As far as vehicles, typically on National Wildlife Refuges, they're limited to highway-approved vehicles. There's virtually no off-road vehicle activity, with the exception that on occasions during hunting programs for access to places, you might have some off-road vehicle access. But typically, it's only for street legal vehicles. Will the public be allowed on conservation easement lands? This, again, we talked about this before. Conservation easement lands, the access to those lands, the uses of those lands, with the exception of the interests that we've acquired, that all stays with the landowner. So if they're allowing you hunting access, that's not something that we're going to control on those private lands that have conservation easements. What types of easements might we consider? Just to give you an idea of the types of things that we would be interested in. We talked about development, the building of roads, the building of housing developments. That's a primary interest that we would be looking to protect. There might be some opportunities for us to acquire grassland easements. Dry prairie is one of those habitat types here that's important for a lot of different species, and we might want to provide a little bit more management activity and conservation with the dry prairies. So that might be a conservation easement that we would want to protect to a little bit greater extent. Same thing with wetlands. We might want to be doing a little bit of wetland restoration to improve the water quality of the Kissimmee River and Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. And there's also some species that are into the pine flatwoods, and so we might want to consider a conservation easement that protects the forest land as well. Will easements eliminate recreational activities? Again, the answer is no. If we're working with a private landowner and we've purchased a development right, and that landowner has hunting programs or access for ATVs, that's not an interest that we're going to be purchasing. That landowner has every right and authority to keep that on their property and maintain that use of that property. Wilderness came up in the last meeting. Will we designate any of this area as wilderness? It's required of the federal government to consider wilderness in any properties that we have an interest in. However, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Refuge System is an active land managing agency. We are constantly involved in prescribed fire programs, manipulating So on a national wildlife refuge, this is different than the conservation area. This is different than the conservation easements. We have, and it's kind of off the side of the screen, bump that in a little bit. There you go, thank you. So on a national wildlife refuge, the lands that we own in fee title, would we have the authority to control public access? Yes. We would be able to control public access because we would own it. What kind of restrictions might we place on it? We might place restrictions on areas surrounding administrative sites or places where there's going to be school groups. So we might have closed areas. However, same thing. There might be closed areas and sensitive areas. We might work with the state and open it up to state regulations. Or there might be a permit system in place. Fishing, the same way. Most likely according to state regulations. Environmental education, interpretation, photography. There might be certain sites that are set up to space people out, but those are things that we would have an interest in and have some control over. As far as off-road vehicles, I mentioned this before. Would we have the authority? Yes, because we own it. Would it be appropriate to allow? In most cases, if we look at the refuge system as a whole, typically we do not allow off-road vehicle access. There's some unique situations here in South Florida because of the terrain that we might need to think about that as an opportunity to allow public access to get into some certain hunting areas. Airboat operations, would we have the authority? We own the land. But would it? No. You know what? That is a wrong Xbox. On the state sovereign waters, the state sovereign waters, we would not have the authority to control it, nor would we want to. For horses, again, on most of the systems within the Fish and Wildlife Service, nationwide, horses are not allowed, but there might be certain opportunities because here on this refuge, if it's approved, we're talking about a ranching landscape, and because horses are part of that culture here in this part of the world, that might be a use that we would consider allowing. Bicycling, yes. Hiking, yes. Model airplane use, probably not. That's not the purpose of the National Wildlife Refuge System. It's not a Big Six use, and probably wouldn't be allowed on a refuge. So this is just kind of to give you an idea of what we might or might not allow on a refuge. Will federal ownership affect adjoining landowners? I think this was talked about earlier as well. No. We would only have authority to control access on lands that we would actually own. Anybody adjacent to a National Wildlife Refuge, they're still owning their own property. We would exert no control over it. And then the last question that has come up is, would the establishment of this refuge take over management of the lands of any other agency? And again, the answer is no. We're not interested in that. That's not going to be part of the program. I think that's it. What I want to do now is turn it over to Sherry. Thank you very much for your attention. We're going to get into our